Dr. Kumari, welcome back to SSA Talks, and thanks for agreeing to talk about feminism and women's rights movements. And our discussion, I think, will focus on a couple of your key texts on these topics. One is Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World, which was first published in 1986, a book that examines feminist and women's rights movements, especially in the colonized Third World. And importantly, their relationship with the nationalist movements. It's also an award-winning book, I think, which won the Feminist Fortnight Award in Britain in 1986. And the other book that we'll touch very briefly on is a book that you co-authored along with Malathi Alvis, Casting Pearls, the Women's Franchise Movement in Sri Lanka, which is about the Sri Lankan women's struggle for voting rights. To begin this conversation, on a very broad note, what were the early origins of the feminist movement globally, and what did this particular project or a series of movements entail in terms of aims and goals?
Yes, well, we can call it feminist movement, any kind of concern or agitation for women has always existed, takes various forms. Even in the days of the Buddha, there was a kind of debate, should we ordain women or not, and a difference of opinion on that issue. So it has always been there. Now it came into more modern times, it came into prominence with the French Revolution and Declaration of the Rights of Man. That's when a leading feminist who were part of a group called Blue Stockings, which is often a word used for feminists a few decades ago. That book, Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the few women active intellectually and committed feminist of the time. And in 1797, as early as that, she wrote a book called Vindication of the Rights of Women. Because earlier, a famous man had written Vindication of the Rights of Man, or the rights of man, and stressing reason. This was a part of the whole Enlightenment process, whereby influenced by the scholars of the Enlightenment in France, and Rousseau and Voltaire and others, and in England, Hobbes and Locke and people, there was a lot of debate on this question of against royalty, against monarchy, and on the question of social contract and rights of people. Now, at that time, the question arose, okay, you're speaking of rights of man, but what about women? And that's, I think, a point at which the whole debate was launched, and it led to a lot of discussion, especially by the 19th century in Europe. Now, the women's movement had begun, women had begun to organize and to discuss what the most important issues were for what was considered women's liberation. And the consensus was it was education which should come first. And that is true of every country in the world where this question has arisen. What do you do first? And the answer is you educate women, not just in the few years education, but right up to higher levels, universities included. And that was a big advance, which almost happened globally, I think. Now, the questions they raised after this issue of education were franchise. Can women have voting rights? Because in every country, women were not, did not have the vote. And even the men, they only had limited franchise. The rights of man meant the rights of upper class men really, and it meant whites, it didn't mean colonies. So it was led to a handful of people speaking about the right to vote and the right to education and so forth. The women took up the issue of liberalizing the laws, because most of the laws were against women and against married women's property, and the property went to the husband, and all sorts of rather bad laws which existed, especially in England. The reform of the law continued, as well as the issue of birth control. That if you can't control your reproductive rights, then you will be you will have to spend your life reproducing or producing children rather than developing yourself. So all these were 19th century issues which informed feminism. Now, your question was, what happened afterwards? Now, afterwards means, what did that movement spread to other countries? Certainly it did, and in the latter part of the talk I will show how movements in one country, like the suffrage movement for women's vote, gets into the newspapers, into the journals, and it spreads all over the world. And the idea that in every country there should be universal franchise and that women should vote was also one of the issues.
Coming to the book on feminism, or titled Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World, there's a very interesting sort of reason as to why you were motivated to write that book.
Yeah.
What's the story behind
Well, at the time, I was teaching Women and Development Studies in the Institute for Social Studies in Netherlands, at the Institute of Social Studies. And another well-known German feminist who was also teaching there with me had also come as a teacher there. Both of us got together and did series of lectures on feminism in Europe, which they published as a book in the ISS. And it dealt with the liberal strategy and the socialist strategy of how do you liberate women and how do you deal with the problem. Now, while doing that with Maria Mies, I was thinking about this question. Another factor simultaneously was that the students I taught all said, we have no social problems affecting women in our country. The women are free because we are Hindu or Buddhist or Islamist or Christian, whatever, and that there is no problem. So I was hearing this voice coming again and again, that may be in India, Sati, or that may be somewhere else, China or somewhere, but not in our countries. So I thought I'd better probe this one also to see whether it is true. And in probing, I found there had been quite a lot of agitation on the women's issue in almost every country in Asia that I looked at. I looked at a cluster of Egypt, Turkey, Iran, one group, and then India, Sri Lanka, and then Vietnam, China, Japan, Korea. Those were the main 11 countries, I think it was, to see what was the reality, what was really happening. And I had the advantage of a good library in Amsterdam, the Women's Archives of Amsterdam, where a lot of material was there, which would not have been available to me anywhere else. So I just started the idea of looking looking for evidence of what I had a hunch that there must have been some evidence. And it's in that process that in Holland, I actually wrote this book in Holland, which came out as a kind of handout for students. Cyclostyle, like produce book in-house book. And then I sent a copy to a person I knew in Z Books. And they were very interested. So they said, look, just expand it a bit, add a few more countries and we'll publish. And that's how the book came to be published.
Dr. Kumari, one of the popular arguments raised with regard to feminism is that it's a Western ideology. But you try to argue in the book that it's not so. How is that?
Well, the students I had in Holland were saying that to me. It is Western. So I said, so what is the problem even if it is Western? Are you going to reject it for that reason alone? But anyway, let's look and see. Is it true that we had no feminist history of our own? Let's try and look. And that's when I began to do a country by country study to see what evidence there was. Women in these countries going back to early 19th century almost to express their views on women's subjugation and so forth. I found a very interesting example from Sri Lanka that in 1840 there was a southern Matara poet called Runahamini who was a scholar and translated the Bible from English to Sinhala. And then she wrote a kavi, 4 lines, saying, if a man had done this translation, he would have got Tanaturu Saha Mudal. He would have got money and honors. Since I was a woman, they didn't bother to give me anything. Now that's a very early plea for equal rights and equal pay, saying, why should a man get more and why should I get less? And that was an example that there may be in all these countries. Examples either of individual women who spoke out or men who spoke out on women's rights. Because that's also a phenomenon in third world countries, that the more enlightened men take the issue on.
One thing that was common to most of these countries that you examined was colonialism, and the period that you examined is also the period when nationalist movements were sort of struggling against colonial domination. How did nationalism and feminism come together? What was the relationship like to these movements?
Well, most of these countries were in either direct foreign rule or some kind of foreign interference in their affairs. And in most of those countries I spoke of, there was growing nationalist movements of people who objected to imperialism and its influence. Now, these people felt that if you are going to go before the imperial powers and say, why don't you go and give up and give us home rule, self-determination, independence, whatever. If we are going to do that, we'd better clean up our society. Because their argument would be, you're backward, look at the condition of your women, and some of the issues were sati in India,